Mark viewed his life as a series of meticulous blueprints where every human emotion was merely a structural element to be controlled. As an architect, he designed spaces people admired, yet understood nothing of the warmth required to live within them. His relationship with Sarah had become background noise he assumed would always be there, like a steady heartbeat. He was a man defined by steel and glass, building a professional career that had become a fortress used to keep real intimacy at bay. To Mark, love was a secondary project, always deferred in favor of more pressing deadlines. On their 10th anniversary, rain lashed against the windows of their high-rise apartment, mirroring the silent storm brewing in Sarah's eyes. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing a gourmet meal, lighting expensive candles, and choosing a vintage wine that held a specific memory from their first year together. Arriving 3 hours late, Mark didn't even notice the effort. He saw only a deadline he had missed and a phone that wouldn't stop vibrating in his pocket. He sat at the table, his mind still at the office. When his phone rang, he didn't hesitate. He spoke about city permits for 20 minutes while the woman who held his life together realized she was no longer part of his design. The breakup was a quiet, devastating exit. When Sarah began silently packing her suitcases, Mark stood in the dark bedroom doorway with his arms crossed, a condescending smile on his lips. He told her she was being dramatic and that she was simply overreacting to a little work stress. He told her he would see her in the morning when she had calmed down and returned to her senses. He believed her presence was permanent, something he owned rather than earned. He watched her leave into the cold rain with the arrogance of a man who thought he held every card, convinced she was just trying to make a point. The next morning, the heavy silence in the apartment was a physical weight. There was no coffee brewing, no sound of her humming in the shower. On the kitchen island, a single note stood as a tombstone for their life together. "I am tired of being invisible," it read. Even then, Mark's ego shielded him from the truth. He convinced himself she would return within 2 days, once the reality of her bank balance set in, or the loneliness of a hotel room became too much to bear. He went about his week with cold defiance, waiting for the apology he felt he was owed. However, as the days turned into weeks, the cracks in his perfect life began to widen. He realized he didn't know how to navigate the daily world without her silent management. He couldn't find his ties, the dry cleaning was forgotten, and the pantry was empty. He realized that Sarah had been the silent architect of his entire existence, managing every detail so he could focus on his own ambition. The scent of her perfume lingering on a discarded scarf was a ghost that followed him, and the empty side of the bed became a canyon he couldn't cross. The turning point came 14 days later. Mark was mindlessly scrolling through social media when he saw a photo from a mutual friend's account. It was a picture of a mountain retreat, and there was Sarah. She looked younger, lighter, and genuinely happy. The hollow look in her eyes had been replaced by a spark he hadn't seen in years. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Mark stared at the screen, his mind already drafting a logical plan to win her back. He would offer her a new car and a grand vacation. But as he zoomed in, his heart dropped. A man's hand was draped comfortably around her slender waist. She wasn't just gone, she was already in someone else's arms. Mark stared at the glowing laptop screen, his eyes burning as he dissected the high-resolution photo. As an architect, he was trained to see the structural integrity of things, but now he was using those skills for a far more desperate purpose. He needed a name for the man whose hand rested so comfortably on Sarah's waist. Through a series of cold, calculated searches and mutual connections, the identity finally surfaced: Julian. He was a veterinarian, a man Sarah had known briefly during their university years. Mark felt a surge of professional elitism, a hollow attempt to protect his bruised ego. He tried to convince himself that a man who spent his life tending to animals was no match for a man who reshaped skylines. But as he scrolled through Julian's life, he saw photos of him volunteering at shelters and laughing with friends in candid, unposed moments. There was a warmth in Julian's expressions that Mark couldn't replicate with all the blueprints in the world. The obsession began to consume him, a structural failure in his own psyche. He needed to prove he was still the superior choice, the original architect of her happiness. When he learned Sarah would be attending a local art gallery opening, he saw it as his chance to re-establish the old order. He dressed with meticulous care, selecting a charcoal suit that whispered of power and success. He walked into the gallery with the practiced confidence of a man who owned the room. When he finally spotted her, his breath hitched. Sarah looked different. She was wearing a deep emerald dress that made her eyes dance with a light he hadn't seen in years. He approached her, his voice smooth and commanding. "Sarah," he said, waiting for the familiar flicker of submission or longing. But when she turned, the look in her eyes wasn't anger or even sadness. It was pity. It was the devastating, quiet compassion one feels for a stranger who has lost their way. He launched into his rehearsed speech, talking about his latest prestigious contract and a trip he wanted to take her on to Paris. He spoke as if their 10 years together were a debt she still owed him. Sarah simply listened, her silence more deafening than any argument. Before he could reach for her hand, Julian appeared. He didn't look like a rival, he looked like a partner. He was dressed simply, his presence calm and grounded. He didn't interrupt. He waited for Sarah to acknowledge him. Mark watched, paralyzed, as Julian focused entirely on her. When Sarah spoke, Julian listened with an intensity that made everything else in the crowded room disappear. He wasn't checking his phone or scanning the room for clients. He was there, entirely present, providing a sanctuary of attention that Mark had never bothered to build. The contrast was a physical blow to Mark's pride. He watched from across the room as Julian held the door for her, his hand lightly touching the small of her back in a gesture of pure, unforced support. In a fit of desperation, Mark decided to double down on the only way he knew how to show value: wealth. Over the next week, he flooded Sarah's new apartment with expensive peace offerings. He sent towering arrangements of lilies and imported chocolates. He even sent a designer watch with a note that read, "For the time I owe you." He waited for the phone call, the thank you, the crack in her resolve. Instead, a courier arrived at his office with a heavy box. Inside were the gifts, returned and untouched. Taped to the top was a scrap of paper with words that cut deeper than any architectural critique. "Give these to someone who still believes your lies." Driven to the edge, Mark drove to her apartment during a torrential downpour. He waited in the shadows, the rain soaking through his expensive coat until he felt the cold in his bones. When Sarah finally appeared, he stepped into the light, looking like a man defeated by his own design. They stood under a flickering street lamp, the air thick with the smell of wet asphalt. Mark began to shout, his voice cracking as he brought up their decade of history, accusing her of replacing him with a stranger. Sarah looked at him, her face pale but resolute. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, Mark," she said, her voice rising above the sound of the rain. "I left because I finally started loving myself, and I realized there was no room for me in the life you built." As the words settled like lead in his chest, the apartment door opened. Julian stepped out, his eyes instantly finding Sarah. He didn't use aggression or posturing. He simply walked to her side and placed a protective arm around her, shielding her from the wind. In that moment, Mark looked into Julian's eyes and saw a fierce, genuine devotion that had nothing to do with status or success. He saw the man he should have been, and he realized with a sickening clarity that Julian wasn't just a rebound. He was the man who was actually building a home for Sarah's heart, while Mark was still standing outside, clutching the blueprints of a ghost. The news of the proposal reached Mark like a structural failure in a building he thought was invincible. A mutual friend mentioned Julian was planning to pop the question on Saturday at the Sunset Cliffside. That jagged edge of the world was where Mark and Sarah had shared their very first date a decade ago. Mark didn't spend his time mourning. Instead, he channeled his desperation into a final grand design. He drafted a speech to dismantle Julian's simple life and remind Sarah of the sophisticated world they once shared. He purchased a diamond that cost more than a luxury apartment, a cold piece of carbon he believed could outweigh the genuine warmth Julian offered. He convinced himself this was the climax of their story, the moment the hero rescues the heroine from a temporary lapse in judgment. On the evening of the proposal, Mark drove like a man possessed. The engine roared, shattering the evening's calm. As he navigated the coastal roads, he practiced his lines, his voice booming in the leather-scented cabin. He would tell her he was a changed man, that his blueprints were now redrawn with her as the sole focus. He reached the trailhead as the sky bled into shades of violet and gold. He left his car idling and ran toward the cliff, his expensive shoes slipping on the dirt, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. He was going to save her, he told himself. He was going to fix the structure before the foundation was poured elsewhere. He arrived at the tree line, gasping for air, but stopped dead when he saw them. The scene was bathed in the dying light of a perfect day, making everything look soft and ethereal. Julian was there, holding both of Sarah's hands in his. Mark took a step forward, his mouth opening to deliver the rehearsed speech that would surely change everything. But then he saw her face. Sarah wasn't just smiling, she looked entirely at peace. As Julian dropped to one knee, the world seemed to go silent. Mark watched as Sarah's hands flew to her face. She was crying, but these weren't the lonely tears of neglect he had caused for years. These were tears of safety. They were the tears of a woman who had finally found her home. In that golden moment, the grand speech Mark had practiced turned to ash. He realized that if he stepped out now, he wouldn't be saving her. He would be the wrecking ball destroying her joy. He saw Julian slide a modest ring onto her finger, and the way Sarah collapsed into his embrace with an ease Mark had never earned. For the first time, Mark looked at a structure and realized it didn't need his revisions. Their love was solid, built on a foundation of presence and respect. True love, he finally understood, wasn't about possession or projects. It was the selfless courage to be absent when your presence was no longer a gift. He didn't say a word. He slowly backed away into the shadows of the trees, his mind finally clear. He took the expensive ring box from his pocket and set it gently in the tall grass, leaving it as a silent monument to the man he used to be. He walked back to his car, the silence of the woods feeling more honest than his previous excuses. The empty house greeted him, but he didn't fill it with work. He sat in the dark and allowed the weight of his loss to settle, accepting that some lessons are only learned through the permanence of goodbye. Months later, Mark was rebuilding his internal world. He sat in a therapist's office, learning how to dismantle the walls of ego he had spent 40 years constructing. One morning, he opened the newspaper to a wedding photo of Sarah and Julian looking radiant against mountain wildflowers. Mark didn't feel the sting of jealousy. He looked at Sarah's happy eyes and felt a quiet peace. He whispered a soft thank you to the photograph, acknowledging the woman who taught him how to love by leaving him behind. He closed the paper and stepped into the sun, a man finally ready to start building something real.